Hey 4th Hour A Push! Welcome to our review video. Today, Bridie, Naomi, and I will be covering chapters 13 and 14 from periods 4 through 5 in the Give Me Liberty textbook. Starting with chapter 13. Here's an overview of the social, political, and economic aspects of this chapter as well as the important people to know. In the years following 1840, Native American removal had been completed in the United States, and slavery had grown into one of the biggest topics in American politics. It was in this decade that a large migration further west had sparked. This movement was fueled by manifest destiny, sectionalism along with it. The Texas Revolt, pushing further into what was then independent Mexico and now Texas, the number of colonists in the area rose rapidly until they exceeded the amount of non-Indian people of Spanish origin called Tejanos in the area. Next, the election of 1844, in which James Polk rose as a victor. A Democrat, Polk had 4 goals in which he accomplished. Another key figure of this time is Henry Clay. He was the leader of the Whig Party and creator of the American System proposal. However, eventually the Whigs will dissolve in the 1850s because of their weak platform. The Mexican-American War was the first American conflict to be fought primarily on foreign soil. The majority of Americans supported the war, and over 60,000 volunteers enlisted and fought on the war's fronts. Eventually, 2 years later, the Mexican-American War will end via an agreement between the two countries, known as the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo. Two notable products of this treaty are the annexation of Texas by the United States, as well as the Mexican Cession, in which the U.S. also gained present-day California, New Mexico, Arizona, Nevada, and Utah. Next, the Wilmot Proviso in 1846. David Wilmot was a Democratic representative who proposed an amendment to prohibit slavery in all aforementioned territories. This issue divided the nation, not by political party, but by geographic location. Those from the North approved, but almost all Southerners opposed. The Wilmot Proviso would never fully pass, but it shined a light on the growing issue of slavery as well. 2 years later, in 1848, a new party emerged and would be known as the Free Soil Party, which had formed in opposition of slavery's expansion. Martin Van Buren was nominated under this party and ran against 3 other candidates. The anti-slavery standpoint was no longer viewed as radical and outlandish. It was now a respectable political position. The free soil position was attractive and was appealing because any regular working-class Northerner or new immigrant seeking untaken opportunities would most likely move west, and if there were slaves in this area, those opportunities wouldn't exist. Workers can't compete with a slave on economic terms. Eventually, the term free soil evolves into free labor, referring to being able to work for whatever you want and get paid, versus competing with slave labor. This ideological change occurs as the original free soil platform is absorbed by the Republicans. One of the most important terms in this video to remember for the AP exam is the Compromise of 1850. This compromise was produced by Henry Clay and included the following 4 sections. First, California will enter the Union as a free state without slavery. 2. Slave trade, not slavery itself, but slave trade, will be abolished in the U.S. Capitol. 3. The creation of a stricter fugitive slave law will occur, which sparked further controversy on the issue of slavery, as well as giving the federal government authority in cases involving runaway slaves. Many Northerners strongly opposed this act. And finally, slavery's status in remaining territories from the Mexican Cession will be determined by local white residents. We can also see this through the Kansas-Nebraska Act of 1854, which was proposed by a pro-westward development Senator Douglas. This act is another very significant term in this video, as it is one of the most divisive pieces of legislation in U.S. history. Senator Douglas hoped to apply the principle of popular sovereignty, meaning the status of slaves would be up to the discretion of individual states. This act revokes the terms of the Missouri Compromise and makes slavery eligible in land that had previously banned it. The unity of the Democratic Party is thus destroyed, and many northern states are unhappy with this act. The vote on the Kansas-Nebraska Act was extremely close. And finally, the act stimulated the event bleeding Kansas, in which tensions caused several fights to break out between pro- and anti-slavery groups. So, to reiterate, the United States was heavily involved in continental expansion, which further provoked controversy on the issue of slavery as they expanded west. In 1854, during this time period, another political party emerged. The American Party, or the Know-Nothing Party, was set on nativist ideas, meaning that natural-born citizens should be favored. They were hostile towards immigrants, they were anti-Catholic, and they were also anti-slavery. The party will dissolve after a few years, and the Republican Party became the major opponent to the Democratic Party by the mid to late 1850s.
One person to note was Chief Justice Roger B. Taney. He presided over the Dred Scott v. Sanford case and ruled that even though Dred Scott was a slave who had lived in a free state for 10 years, he ruled that free blacks could never sue in court for their freedom because they could never be U.S. citizens. Also in this case, he ruled that the Missouri Compromise was illegal because Congress had no power to prohibit slavery in the territories, and slave masters were guaranteed property rights under the Fifth Amendment. The election of 1860 was a divisive election which directly led to the Civil War. Republican candidate Abraham Lincoln, who opposed the expansion of slavery but was not an abolitionist, won the presidency on the grounds that he would not touch the existing slavery system. However, Southern states doubted he would keep his word, and his election led to the secession of South Carolina, followed by many other Southern states who would then become the Confederate States of America. As for the Democratic Party during this 1860 election, it was split sectionally by the issue of slavery. The Northern and Southern economies were also distinct. The Southern economy was mainly based on agriculture and still relied on slavery to produce the cotton. The Northern economy was more diverse than the South. It had banking, commerce, industry, and trade. Beginning in the 1930s, railroads allowed for Western economy to be connected to Northern industrialization, and the railroads created new markets and helped the Northern and Western industries prosper.
Next, on to Chapter 14. Again, here are the key terms and concepts to know for this chapter.
In 1861, the attack on Fort Sumter effectively started the fighting of the Civil War. The Confederacy attacked Union soldiers stationed at Fort Sumter. Though the conflict had been brewing long before 1861, this marked the beginning of the actual fighting of the Civil War. In the earlier parts of the war, the Union was losing pretty bad due to poor generals and a poor strategy. Lincoln knew that he needed to do something, so he drafted the Emancipation Proclamation. The Battle of Antietam in 1862 was the victory that the Union needed in order for Lincoln to issue the preliminary Emancipation Proclamation and be taken seriously. It would take effect on January 1st of 1863, and it would free all the slaves in states that were fighting against the Union. This went back on Lincoln's earlier promise not to mess with the slave system of the South, and it also effectively reframed the war as a moral battle against slavery. It is important to note that the Emancipation Proclamation did not abolish slavery. It only freed slaves in states that were fighting against the Union. This did not include the border states of Delaware, Kentucky, Maryland, Missouri, and West Virginia, who were part of the Union even though they held slaves. Their slaves were not freed after the Emancipation Proclamation. The Second American Revolution was a term used to describe the Civil War conflict and the subsequent emancipation. It brought about many changes within American life, both socially and politically, most notably the freedom gained by former slaves and the realization of the democratic ideals of America.
Some new technologies that furthered the war were the telegram and the grenades. The northern economy was strong during the war. They had lots of infrastructure, and it led to the railroad and road systems, and this allowed for greater mobilization of people and goods. And the Union's strategy was to use their navy to block the southern port. So the southern economy wasn't doing as well as the northern economy. The King diplomacy strategy was a failure, as Britain and France now found markets from which to buy cotton and did not support the South in the war. And the Confederate economic strategy was to be on the defensive with occasional thrusts to the north and use the King cotton diplomacy to rope Britain and France into the war on their side. So the status of blacks during this time is that they were fighting for the Union because they were grateful for the freedom that they were given. And the war gave them hope that they can have a better life. And then black codes were also put into place. So radical Republicans also became big in this time, and their belief inequality, regardless of race, made them very radical. So two acts that really helped westward expansion grow during this time were the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 and the Homestead Act of 1863. And the Pacific Railway Act of 1862 offered money to men willing to expand the Transcontinental Railroad out west. So the Homestead Act, which took effect the same day as the Emancipation Proclamation, made Western settling grow because It offered 160 acres of land to anyone who would live on that land for 5 years. And this is a concrete example of manifest destiny in the country spreading. So the 10% plan of Reconstruction was Lincoln's idea on how to readmit the Confederate States back into the Union. And he proposed that if 10% of the people in the South who voted in the 1860 election swore loyalty to the Union, the Confederate States would be allowed to reestablish their own governments within the Union. So the Wade-Davis bill was proposed, and it required 50% of voters to swear allegiance to the Union, and only then could they establish new constitutions. He thought this was too harsh of a plan, and Pocket vetoed it. Appomattox was the site of the Confederate surrender that ended the Civil War fighting, and General Lee was forced to surrender to Grant in April of 1865. The Union had won the fighting due to more abundant supplies and mobilization, but the underlying conflicts and issues of the war were far from settled. The tensions and debates over slavery, rights of African Americans, and sectional differences would continue for many years and are still even present today. The Freedmen's Bureau of 1865 established schools and provided aid for poor, and the goal was to support the newly emancipated African Americans who would otherwise be very limited in opportunities that they could have. The U.S. economically recovered from the Civil War by chartering banks and printing legal tender money, and paper money was printed in excess and then taken out of the system, which made people reluctant to spend their money. Ultimately, the U.S. moved to the gold standard, which backed legal tender money with a fixed amount of gold.
Thanks so much for watching. Here's our works cited page, and good luck on the AP test.